Okay, and we're rolling. Hello guys, and welcome back all 1,600 members of this channel. Today we're going to be discussing Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, and all things in that AlphaTauri Visa Cash App team. Now you may be wondering, because most of you or some of you may have seen I did post a video similar to this or similar in topics to this before. Well, since then, the Australian Grand Prix has happened and the Japanese Grand Prix has happened. And at the end of the video, I very much gave the consensus. Although Danny Rick is on the way out, in my opinion, he still can pull this out of the fire. But after watching the Australian and the Japanese Grand Prix, I feel very confident in saying Daniel Ricciardo cannot pull this out of the fire. And the only reason he is here is because of bad politics in Formula One. Now, for those of you who might have missed the Australian or the Japanese Grand Prix, to summarize very quickly, in the Australian Grand Prix, in Daniel Ricciardo's home race, Yuki Tsunoda did out-qualify him and he outraced him, with Daniel Ricciardo lagging behind and not being able to score points. Yuki Tsunoda grabbing a P7 and securing a lot of points on the board. Now, fast forward to the Japanese Grand Prix that has just recently passed. And although they were a lot closer, Daniel qualifying in P11 and Yuki Tsunoda in P10, this would be arguably a bigger blow because it is Yuki Tsunoda's home Grand Prix and the attention was firmly on him the whole weekend. In this Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo decided to take himself and Lance Stroll out. Personally, I do think it is a racing incident. Although Daniel Ricciardo is the person technically to blame, it's a first lap collision. There were people on the inside, people on the outside. He was right to look more towards the apex of the corner to see who was going to come on his inside, but that's racing. But where the rubber meets the road is that at the end of the day, he did DNF because of an error he made, and he did take Alex Albon out with him. Now, on the other side of the garage, Yuki Tsunoda, although he had two pretty bad starts in my opinion, he managed to claw it back, make some great overtakes, and get points in his home Grand Prix, which now puts him at 7 points in the Drivers' Championship and AlphaTauri 7 points in the Constructors' Championship. I looked at last year's results with Nick De Vries versus Daniel Ricciardo in the first 4 rounds of the season, and similarly, Daniel Ricciardo and Nick De Vries both had a DNF due to a mistake they made. But unsimilarly, Yuki Tsunoda has scored 7 points against Daniel Ricciardo this season, whereas last season, Yuki Tsunoda only scored 2 points against Daniel Ricciardo. So the deficit to Yuki Tsunoda is more than three times as big this year than it was last year to Nick De Vries. And Nick De Vries was treated very harshly by Red Bull. Which brings me on to my next point, which is that Daniel Ricciardo doesn't really seem to need to do much. Red Bull hasn't really spoken too much about him. I mean, at least Horner hasn't. I remember last year, Horner was very much highlighting the mistakes of Nick De Vries, but it seems like he's very reluctant, for obvious reasons, to highlight mistakes of Daniel and to show that Daniel isn't what he used to be. Not only that, from a personal standpoint and personal observation, not only is Daniel in F1 due to politics and inside relations, let's just call it, but it's literally the only reason he's in a contentious position for that Red Bull seat. Because although I'm making this video saying Daniel Ricciardo is done, I know very much so that in that Red Bull office, they're going to still be discussing Daniel Ricciardo as a better replacement to Sergio Perez than Yuki Tsunoda. And it sounds odd to say, one, because Perez is doing so well, and two, because Yuki's outperforming Daniel. But if Red Bull had to choose any one of those AlphaTauri drivers to replace Sergio Perez at this point in time, in this second, I don't think you would be bad betting to say that they would still choose Daniel despite his horrible performances. I would go as far as to say that at the end of the season, or maybe halfway through the season, if Sergio Perez starts to get a very bad dip in performance like he did last year, and Daniel Ricciardo has maybe 1 or 2 or 3 good performances in a row, not much, slightly better than Yuki Tsunoda. And I'm talking if Yuki Tsunoda was bodying him apart from those 2 or 3 races, I am near certain, 100% certain, in fact I am 100% certain that Red Bull will ignore the fact he has been getting bodied the whole season and they would still give him that seat. It looks to me like Red Bull are doing everything in their power to justify Daniel Ricciardo, not only in F1, but to give him a Red Bull seat, and it just isn't happening. Sergio Perez is doing well, and we're going to get onto Sergio Perez in a little bit, but Sergio Perez is doing relatively well. The car is very fast, Max Verstappen is dominating, and Yuki Tsunoda is bodying Daniel Ricciardo, which obviously leads to a hierarchy or a totem pole order of where does Daniel Ricciardo lie. So obviously you have Max Verstappen at the top, you have Sergio Perez, you have Yuki Tsunoda, and I would put Liam Lawson ahead of Daniel Ricciardo. So in my opinion, Daniel Ricciardo is the 5th best driver in that current Red Bull family. And, you know, obviously a driver not being the best driver in the whole of that Red Bull organization isn't the worst thing in the world. Yuki Tsunoda isn't the best driver in that whole Red Bull organization. But what makes it bad is that I've seen a lot of comments of people genuinely saying that Daniel brings experience and things like that to the team. And I made a comment on this, and I'm going to make the same comment again. He doesn't actually bring any experience to that AlphaTauri team. Yuki Tsunoda does. Yuki's been there longer, so he knows more about the car and the characteristics. And even in the ground effects era that came in 2022, Daniel had a poor season at McLaren in which he got sacked. In 2023, he missed half of the season, came in at AlphaTauri, and then was beaten by Yuki Tsunoda. And now he's come back in 2024 to get beaten by Yuki Tsunoda. Daniel Ricciardo has no experience that is genuinely valuable to give to the team because he just isn't the driver that he once was in a regulation set that is foreign to him. And this is exacerbated a lot by this season. This 2024 F1 season is lacking in some areas, but in some areas, it really is raising tension. And one of those is the fight in midfield and lower midfield. Because of the fact that Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, and Aston Martin are basically all top teams in their own right, in the sense that they could beat each other on their day, it makes it so that there technically isn't any points to be scored by any lower midfield teams and backmarker teams unless some sort of incident occurs or a driver is terrible. Lance Stroll. And obviously this weekend it was Lance Stroll who bit the bullet, and we're going to talk about Lance Stroll later on in the video. But because of this tight gap or this tight point scoring positions where maybe in 2019 and 2020 there was Red Bull and there was Mercedes and maybe there was Ferrari in 2019, but generally speaking it was the top 4 and then 7, 8, 9, 10 was best of the rest. But now, because there are so many teams fighting further up the grid, it makes it so that scoring any single point is a lot more coveted. And so Daniel Ricciardo scoring a point, unless something drastic happens, is going to become increasingly hard, like it has been for many teams this season and every single recurring season. This competitiveness continues. Now, speaking of Lance Stroll, since he is the reason Yuki Tsunoda had that gap to score P10, Lance Stroll isn't a great driver. I don't think that's a very controversial thing to say. And during the race, he started P18, he made it to about P12, put on the softs somewhere along the line and went forward for a little bit and then went backwards. He got overtaken by a Haas. But then he started complaining on the radio, and I think it is very funny because I was watching the race and I was saying to myself, you know what, I've given Lance Stroll some stick, but he's not a completely terrible driver. And then he proceeded to make that horrible radio call, that annoying, like, it's like a cat screeching a chalkboard. I don't even want to react. I don't even want to react to it. It was his version of a GP2 engine whilst his teammate was out in P6 and he was getting overtaken by Haas's. I don't get how this guy has a seat. Lance Stroll should go, because in truth, without Lance Stroll, Aston won't be the 5th best team, and currently they are 5th in the constructors standings, and they are going to end up 5th in the constructors standings by the end of the year if they don't sack Lance Stroll by the summer break. But obviously they're not going to sack him halfway through the season, so Aston Martin are going to be 5th in the constructors. But I bring up Lance Stroll because obviously we know that Honda deal is going to be there and Yuki Tsunoda could go there. But if Yuki doesn't go there, I have a serious fear that Yuki's career is going to die at RB. Red Bull have shown no interest, have made no comments, have given Yuki no real props, have dangled the carrot of that Red Bull seat in front of him. Not once have I heard it in a single interview. And this may sound harsh on the sense that, as a fan like me, because I'm a massive Yuki Tsunoda fan, but at the same time, when you think about it, Red Bull doesn't really need another driver in that sense. I remember last season in 2023 when Sergio Perez wasn't doing so well, Lewis was challenging him for P2. Everyone made the comment, imagine if next season, or when next season comes and all the teams get their act together and they're going to be closer, Sergio Perez is going to need to be a lot closer to Max Verstappen, or Red Bull could seriously lose the Constructors' Championship. And I, for one, said that as well. But obviously, although the teams have taken a step forward, including Ferrari aren't in a place in which they're genuinely going to challenge Red Bull for the Constructors. Let's be real. The only reason that the gap is so small right now is because, one, Max Verstappen DNF'd in Australia, which we will talk about, and two, there hasn't been that many Grand Prix. And speaking of Australia, just to sidetrack, the one Grand Prix in which Max DNF'd and it was competitive, we saw that Sergio Perez couldn't scoop up after Max. And so there still is a lack of performance with Sergio Perez, but it's a lot less apparent because that RB is still crazy fast and it will remain to be crazy fast. But if you look at the system in Red Bull, Max is 24, 25? Look at someone like Lewis Hamilton or Fernando Alonso. Max could easily, and I really do mean this, easily stay in Red Bull for another decade. Don't listen, guys, do not listen to all these YouTubers that are talking about Max Verstappen going to Mercedes. That is hilariously dumb. They're just trying to capitalize off whatever's clickbait. We all know Max Verstappen isn't going to jump from the literal rocket ship of the grid to a car that is barely scraping P8 on the grid. It doesn't make any sense. He's going to stay at Red Bull until the world literally ends within the team. There is no reason for him to leave Red Bull, and he won't leave Red Bull. So let's stop acting like he will leave Red Bull just to capitalize off of some YouTube views. But he can stay there for another 10 years. And so Red Bull have a dilemma where, do they bring in a younger driver that's going to want to challenge for the title, or do they effectively bring in a Sergio Perez? And what I mean by a Sergio Perez is a driver that is simply happy to be there. Sergio Perez, great driver. He is another driver that I hold very highly, especially in his Force India Racing Point days. I think those were probably some of his best days. But let's keep it a buck. Sergio Perez is happy to be there. He's not trying to challenge for the title. Maybe he did at the start of 2022, but after Miami and after he started not qualifying in Q1, he was very much happy to be there, and he will be very much happy to be there. Daniel Ricciardo, as much as Daniel Ricciardo is going to want to get into that car and be closer to Max, if push comes to shove, he's going to be told to stand down, and he will, because he's going to be happy to be there. But someone who is younger, who is a lot more hot-headed like Yuki Tsunoda is, even though Yuki has calmed down a bit, he's going to be more likely to want to disobey team orders and look for where he can gain instead of Max. And Red Bull simply don't need it. They have a car that can win the constructors and the drivers comfortably. They have a second driver that can be 15 seconds behind and still come comfortably P2, 10 seconds faster than P3. They really, and I really mean this, they really don't need a driver that has to be 2 seconds behind Max and that is challenging him. In fact, some would say that's one of the last things they need. The last thing they need is on-track battles between teammates. They need their teammates far enough to help each other in strategy, but not close enough to want to fight each other. And so Yuki simply isn't a fit for Red Bull. But Yuki needs to pack up and go somewhere else. I was watching Aldas's video earlier, and he mentioned Williams. Now, although I don't think that's possible because of Kimi Antonelli and Alex Albon, I think Honda at Aston Martin is probably his best bet. After that, I'll be honest, I don't know where else he could possibly go. I genuinely don't know. Maybe that second Alpine seat. I don't know. Can someone tell me who was going to populate that second Alpine seat? It looks to me like they're going to keep Gasly. So I don't know who else would stay in that Alpine seat. But other than that, there is nowhere else I can think of where Yuki Tsunoda should go, which is a shame. But that Red Bull, that RB seat, is a death trap. It's an absolute death trap because you go there, and when you go there, obviously timing matters to get into that Red Bull seat. But for the next decade or so, you're essentially going in there to try and see who can be second fiddle to Max Verstappen, which isn't the way I think a Formula One team should operate. And RB, you can say that RB has done so much for the sport, and I don't disagree. They've brought a lot of drivers into the sport. The Red Bull Young Driver Program has single-handedly probably brought the most F1 drivers that actually maintain their place in Formula One than any other driver program ever. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they've also cut short more drivers than any other program has. That seat is literally a death trap. No matter how good they perform in, if they don't fit that Red Bull seat, even if they are good enough to keep their seat, they'll just be swapped out for someone younger who potentially could fill that seat in the future. And that will happen to Yuki Tsunoda, because it doesn't look like, and again, someone correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't look like they genuinely care about Yuki Tsunoda being in that seat. They don't care about AlphaTauri scoring points. All they care about is Daniel beating Yuki? Yes, get him in a seat. If not, give him as much time as possible. And they're going to not comment on this for as long as possible. I will not be surprised if by the summer break, that's when they start to bring up the issue of Daniel Ricciardo in interviews. That's when they start to comment on it. Because as of now, they genuinely don't even want to talk about it. And why would they? Horner and Daniel are close. They've been together for over a decade. They know each other. They've won races together. And I'm sure Horner has sent Daniel messages saying, you only need to do this, this, and this, and we can start looking to you as a Red Bull candidate. But as of now, where does this leave Yuki Tsunoda? Is it fair that a driver like this, who has this much quality, is getting pushed off to the side, and then you have drivers like Daniel Ricciardo that is literally getting into Formula One and manages to stay there, although it is not by nepotism, since Horner does regard Daniel as his unbiological son. I'm going to call this nepotism. If Daniel Ricciardo keeps performances like this up and maintains a contract, he's going to be in the same bracket as Lance Stroll, where the head boss that essentially views him as a son keeps him in the sport for the simple fact that he views him as a son. But other than that, you guys tell me, where should Yuki Tsunoda go? What should the future plan be from there? Is Daniel Ricciardo done? I believe he is, but tell me if I'm wrong.